She signed the divorce papers with a smirk, glancing at the man across the table like he was nothing more than a failure clinging to his last shred of dignity. A single father in plain clothes, no powerful attorney, no family backing him up. The hearing seemed destined to end quickly until the judge stopped, reaching for a sealed envelope bearing his late mother's name. The courtroom fell silent. Rebecca's confident expression began to waver. What was written in that will that made the supposed winner suddenly tremble? 3 months before that courtroom moment, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen of his mother's old house, staring at a stack of bills spread across the table. The numbers blurred together after a while, but it did not matter because he already knew the total by heart. His 5-year-old son Ethan was asleep upstairs, clutching a stuffed dinosaur that had seen better days. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood settling, a sound Daniel had grown up hearing and now found strangely comforting. His mother had passed away 8 weeks ago, and the silence she left behind still felt heavy in every room. Daniel worked as a maintenance technician at a local apartment complex, a job that paid enough to cover groceries and keep the lights on, but not much else. He had taken the position 5 years ago when Ethan was born, choosing stability over ambition because someone needed to be home when the daycare closed at 6. Rebecca had never understood that choice, and looking back now, Daniel realized she had started pulling away from him the moment he turned down a promotion that required travel. She wanted a husband who climbed ladders, not one who fixed leaky faucets for other people. His mother Margaret had seen it clearly, even when Daniel refused to acknowledge the cracks forming in his marriage. She would visit on Sundays, bringing homemade soup and quiet observations that Daniel usually brushed aside. Once, after Rebecca had canceled dinner plans to attend a networking event, Margaret had simply said that some people measure love in what you provide, not in who you are. Daniel had defended his wife that night, calling his mother old-fashioned. Now, sitting in this empty kitchen, he wished he could take back every dismissive word. The marriage had unraveled quickly after Margaret's death. Rebecca showed up at the funeral in a black dress that cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, spent 20 minutes accepting condolences from people she barely knew, and left early to catch a conference call. She did not cry, did not hold Daniel's hand, did not ask how he was coping. That night, when Daniel sat alone in his childhood bedroom unable to sleep, he finally admitted to himself what his mother had known all along. Rebecca had married him expecting potential, and when that potential never materialized into wealth or status, she simply stopped investing in the relationship. 2 weeks after the funeral, Rebecca moved into a downtown apartment, claiming she needed space to think. Daniel did not argue because he was too exhausted from grief and single parenting to fight for something that already felt dead. Ethan asked every night when Mommy was coming home, and Daniel ran out of gentle lies faster than he expected. He told his son that sometimes grown-ups needed to live in different houses, and Ethan had accepted this explanation with the heartbreaking trust that only children possess. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who did not make eye contact. Daniel signed for the envelope and sat on the porch steps for nearly an hour before opening it. Inside, he found exactly what he expected: a petition for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. What he did not expect was the attached property declaration, where Rebecca had listed his mother's house as a marital asset subject to division. The house where Daniel grew up, where Margaret had raised him alone after his father left, where she had spent her final years watching her grandson take his first steps. Rebecca wanted half of it, or more precisely, she wanted Daniel to sell it and split the proceeds. Daniel called his wife that evening, forgetting for a moment that she was no longer someone he could simply call. Rebecca answered on the 4th ring, her voice flat and businesslike. She explained that her attorney had reviewed everything and determined that since the house was transferred to Daniel during the marriage, it qualified as marital property. Daniel tried to explain that the house had been in his family for over 40 years, that his mother had only put his name on the deed to avoid probate complications. Rebecca cut him off, saying that sentiment did not hold up in court, and that he should find a lawyer if he wanted to contest anything. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of legal consultations Daniel could not afford, and sleepless nights he could not escape. Every attorney he met with delivered the same assessment. Without clear documentation proving the house was intended as a separate inheritance, Rebecca's claim had merit. Daniel's best option was to negotiate a settlement, perhaps buying out her share over time, or selling the house and finding something smaller. The thought of strangers living in his mother's home, painting over the height marks on the kitchen doorframe, ripping out the garden she had tended for decades, made Daniel physically ill. Rebecca, meanwhile, seemed to grow more confident with each passing day. She texted Daniel updates about the divorce proceedings, as if they were discussing a business transaction, which to her they probably were. She mentioned that her attorney had filed motions to expedite the case, that she had already found a buyer interested in the property, that Daniel should really consider being reasonable about this. The word reasonable appeared in almost every message, always carrying the implication that Daniel was being emotional and difficult for wanting to keep his childhood home. One evening, while sorting through his mother's belongings in the attic, Daniel found a box he did not recognize. Inside were documents he had never seen before, financial statements from a company called Hartwell Holdings, stock certificates dated back to the 1970s, and a letter addressed to him in his mother's handwriting. The letter was brief, instructing Daniel to contact a man named Robert Foster at a law firm downtown, and to do so only if his marriage ever ended. Daniel read the letter 3 times, trying to understand why his mother, who had worked as a school secretary her entire life, would have documents connecting her to a company he had never heard of. He considered calling the number on the letterhead that same night, but stopped himself. Something about his mother's specific instruction, the emphasis on waiting until his marriage ended, made Daniel hesitant to act prematurely. The divorce was not finalized yet, and perhaps Margaret had her reasons for the timing. Instead, he carefully returned everything to the box and hid it in the back of his closet, behind winter coats that had not been worn in years. Whatever secrets his mother had kept, they could wait until the legal dust settled. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late October. Daniel arrived at the courthouse wearing the only suit he owned, a navy blue number he had bought for his wedding 7 years ago. It still fit, though the shoulders felt tighter than he remembered. He had not hired an attorney despite the advice of everyone he consulted, partly because he could not afford one, and partly because he had already decided to stop fighting. Rebecca would get her share of the house, he would figure out some way to keep it, and life would continue in its diminished form. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes late, accompanied by a sharp-looking woman in a gray pantsuit, who immediately began arranging documents on the plaintiff's table. Daniel recognized the confidence in their movements, the casual certainty of people who expected to win. His ex-wife glanced at him once, a quick assessment that seemed to confirm whatever low opinion she already held. She looked polished and composed, her hair professionally styled, her jewelry tasteful, but clearly expensive. Daniel wondered how she afforded all of it on her marketing manager salary, then decided he did not actually want to know. The judge entered, and the proceedings began with the usual formalities. Rebecca's attorney presented their case efficiently, outlining the division of assets and emphasizing that both parties had agreed to the terms in principle. Daniel was asked if he had any objections, and he almost said no, almost let the whole thing end right there. But something stopped him, a memory of his mother's letter, the strange instruction to contact that lawyer only after his marriage ended. Daniel heard himself asking the court for one consideration before finalizing everything. He requested that his mother's will be read into the record, as it contained provisions relevant to the property in question. Rebecca's attorney objected immediately, arguing that the will had already been processed through probate and had no bearing on the divorce proceedings. The judge asked Daniel if he had documentation supporting his request. Daniel produced the letter from his mother, explaining that she had instructed him to present certain materials to the court when his marriage concluded. The letter referenced a sealed addendum to her will, held by her estate attorney, that she wanted read in open court before any final judgments were made regarding her son's assets. The judge reviewed the letter, her expression unreadable. She noted that the request was unusual, but not without precedent, and that given the property in question had belonged to the deceased, hearing her final wishes seemed appropriate. She ordered a brief recess while the court contacted the estate attorney to retrieve the sealed documents. Rebecca's face tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her composure since arriving. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Rebecca shook her head, her eyes fixed on Daniel with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Daniel sat quietly during the recess, watching courthouse employees move through the hallways and wondering what his mother had done. Margaret had always been a practical woman, careful with money but never wealthy, at least not in any way Daniel could see. She drove the same car for 15 years, clipped coupons until the day she died, and lectured Daniel about saving for emergencies every time he mentioned buying something unnecessary. The idea that she had hidden assets, that she had planned for this exact scenario, seemed impossible, and yet the letter was real. The documents in the attic were real, and somewhere in this building, a sealed envelope waited to reveal whatever truth Margaret had carried in silence for decades. When the hearing resumed, a clerk brought in a manila envelope bearing official seals and the name of the estate law firm. The judge accepted it, broke the seal, and began reviewing the contents. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she read, a subtle reaction that Daniel might have missed if he had not been watching so intently. She looked up at Daniel, then at Rebecca, then back at the documents in her hands. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as if everyone present understood that something unexpected was about to unfold. The judge cleared her throat and announced that she would now read the relevant portions of Margaret's final testament into the record. Before the judge could begin reading, Rebecca's attorney rose from her seat with practiced urgency. She requested a sidebar, arguing that introducing new testamentary documents at this stage was procedurally improper and potentially prejudicial to her client. The judge considered this briefly, then denied the motion, noting that the sealed addendum had been properly filed with the probate court and that its contents were directly relevant to the property under dispute. She reminded the attorney that this was a divorce proceeding, not a criminal trial, and that she had broad discretion to consider any evidence bearing on the equitable distribution of assets. Rebecca's attorney sat down slowly, her jaw tight with frustration. Daniel watched this exchange from across the room, still not fully understanding what his mother had done. The box in his attic had contained documents he could barely interpret, financial statements, and stock certificates that might have been valuable or might have been worthless paper from a defunct company. He had spent the weeks since discovering them in a state of suspended uncertainty, afraid to hope and equally afraid to dismiss the possibility that Margaret had left him something more than memories. Now, sitting in this sterile courtroom with his entire future hanging in the balance, Daniel realized that he was about to learn who his mother really was. The judge began reading in a measured tone that carried easily through the silent room. The first paragraphs were standard legal language, confirming that this addendum superseded any conflicting provisions in Margaret's primary will and establishing the date of its execution as 5 years prior. Daniel did the math quickly and realized his mother had created this document shortly after Ethan was born, around the same time she started making those quiet observations about Rebecca. She had been planning something even then, watching and waiting and preparing for an outcome Daniel himself had refused to see coming. Rebecca shifted in her seat as the judge continued reading. The document described Margaret's relationship with Hartwell Holdings, a family business founded by her father in 1952. According to the text, Margaret had inherited a 12% stake in the company upon her father's death in 1978. Shares she had held quietly for over 4 decades while the company grew from a regional manufacturing operation into a diversified holding corporation with interests in real estate, logistics, and financial services. The current estimated value of her shares, based on the most recent company valuation, exceeded $4 million. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. $4 million. His mother, who had worn the same winter coat for 20 years and refused to let Daniel pay for dinner on the rare occasions they went out, had been sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. She could have retired early, traveled the world, bought a house without drafty windows and a furnace that wheezed every winter. Instead, she had continued working at the elementary school until her health made it impossible, continued clipping coupons and driving her ancient sedan, continued living as if money was something to be hoarded rather than enjoyed. Daniel did not know whether to feel awed by her restraint or heartbroken by her sacrifice. Rebecca's attorney interrupted the reading to request a copy of the documents for immediate review. The judge agreed and instructed the clerk to provide copies to both parties before continuing. During this brief pause, Daniel glanced at his ex-wife and saw something he had never witnessed before: genuine fear. Rebecca's composed exterior had cracked visibly now, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. She whispered something urgent to her attorney, who responded with a sharp shake of her head. Whatever strategy they had prepared for this hearing, it clearly had not accounted for the possibility that the quiet old woman they had dismissed as irrelevant might have been worth millions. The judge resumed reading once the copies were distributed. The next section of the addendum established a trust fund, designated as the Margaret Hartwell Family Trust, with Daniel named as the primary beneficiary and his son Ethan as the secondary beneficiary. The trust was structured to hold all of Margaret's Hartwell Holdings shares, as well as several other investment accounts Daniel had known nothing about. Total assets placed in the trust exceeded $5 million, when including the stock holdings, bond portfolios, and a commercial property in the downtown district that Margaret had purchased in the 1990s and held through a separate limited liability company. Daniel stopped trying to process the numbers because they had ceased to feel real. His mother had been wealthy, seriously wealthy, and she had hidden it from everyone, including her own son. The revelation should have felt like a betrayal, another secret kept by someone he thought he knew completely. Instead, Daniel found himself remembering small moments that suddenly made sense. The way Margaret always insisted on handling her own finances privately. The mysterious meetings she attended once a quarter that she called boring board stuff. The occasional comments about investments that Daniel had assumed referred to her modest retirement account. She had been living a double life of sorts, not out of deception, but out of some philosophy Daniel was only beginning to understand. The judge continued to a section that made Rebecca visibly flinch. Margaret's will contained specific provisions regarding the trust's activation and the conditions under which beneficiaries could access its assets. The primary condition stated that the trust would remain dormant, managed by a professional trustee, until Daniel's marriage was legally dissolved through divorce, annulment, or the death of his spouse. Furthermore, the trust contained an explicit exclusion clause stating that no current or former spouse of Daniel would have any claim to trust assets under any circumstances, regardless of when the marriage ended or what division of property occurred in divorce proceedings. Rebecca's attorney shot to her feet, objecting that such a clause was an obvious attempt to defraud marital creditors and should be considered void as against public policy. The judge listened to the argument patiently, then asked the attorney to cite specific case law supporting her position. The attorney fumbled through her notes, offering general principles about marital property and fraudulent conveyance, but nothing directly on point. The judge noted that trusts established prior to divorce proceedings, particularly those created by third parties rather than the divorcing spouses themselves, were generally protected from marital property claims. She added that she would reserve final judgment on the matter, pending full review, but saw no immediate basis to exclude the documents from consideration. The hearing devolved into a tense back and forth between Rebecca's attorney and the judge, with the attorney growing increasingly aggressive in her objections. She argued that Daniel must have known about the trust and deliberately concealed it during discovery, that the timing of its revelation was suspiciously convenient, that the entire setup was designed to defraud Rebecca of her rightful share of marital assets. Daniel listened to these accusations in silence, knowing that his honest ignorance was his strongest defense. He had not known, could not have known, because his mother had kept her secret perfectly for his entire adult life. The judge eventually called for order and announced that she was recessing the hearing to allow both parties time to review the new documents and prepare appropriate responses. She scheduled a continuation for the following week and warned both attorneys that she expected substantive legal arguments rather than emotional appeals. Before adjourning, she addressed Daniel directly, asking if he had any knowledge of the trust or his mother's financial holdings prior to today. Daniel stood and answered truthfully that he had found some documents in his mother's belongings, but had not understood their significance until this moment. The judge nodded, made a note, and dismissed the court. Rebecca cornered Daniel in the hallway outside the courtroom, her composure fully abandoned now. She demanded to know how long he had been hiding this, how he could sit there pretending to be some struggling single father when his mother was, apparently, a secret millionaire. Daniel tried to explain that he genuinely had not known, that Margaret had never told him anything about the family business or the trust, but Rebecca was not interested in explanations. She accused him of playing her for a fool, of letting her file for divorce, thinking she would get half of a worthless old house, when he knew all along that he stood to inherit a fortune. Her voice rose with each accusation until other people in the hallway began to stare. Daniel did not defend himself because there was nothing to defend. He had not known, but he understood why Rebecca would not believe that. From her perspective, the timing was too perfect, the revelation too convenient. She had spent months positioning herself to extract maximum value from their divorce, and now she discovered that the real value had been hidden from view the entire time. Her anger was the anger of someone who realized they had miscalculated badly, who had treated an opponent as negligible only to discover they had been outmaneuvered. The fact that Daniel had not actually done any maneuvering was irrelevant to her wounded pride. The week between hearings passed in a strange limbo. Daniel contacted the estate attorney mentioned in his mother's letter, a man named Robert Foster, who had known Margaret for over 30 years. Foster explained the full scope of the trust in terms Daniel could finally understand. Margaret had always intended for her wealth to pass to Daniel and his descendants, but she had structured everything to protect the assets from what she called external threats. When Daniel asked what that meant, Foster replied simply that Margaret had never trusted Rebecca from the beginning and had taken steps to ensure that woman would never benefit from Hartwell money. The bluntness of the statement shocked Daniel, but he could not argue with its accuracy. Rebecca's attorney filed multiple motions in the days leading up to the continued hearing, challenging the validity of the trust, demanding full financial disclosure going back 10 years, and requesting sanctions against Daniel for alleged discovery violations. Daniel's lack of legal representation became a serious problem as he struggled to respond to the paperwork flooding his mailbox. Foster offered to connect him with a family law attorney who worked with trust beneficiaries, a woman named Patricia Vance, who agreed to take the case on contingency given the assets now at stake. For the first time since the divorce began, Daniel felt like he might not be facing this battle alone. The continued hearing arrived with a different energy than the first session. Rebecca appeared with reinforcements, 2 additional attorneys joining her original counsel, all of them armed with thick binders of research and case citations. Patricia Vance sat beside Daniel, calm and prepared, having spent the week assembling a defense that anticipated every possible attack. The judge entered and immediately noted the expanded legal teams, commenting dryly that she hoped this hearing would focus on law rather than volume. Nobody laughed. Rebecca's lead attorney opened with a comprehensive assault on the trust's validity. She argued that Margaret had created the document specifically to defraud future divorce proceedings, that the activation clause tied to Daniel's marriage dissolution proved improper intent, and that the exclusion of spouses violated basic principles of marital property law. She cited cases from multiple jurisdictions, presented expert declarations on trust law, and painted a picture of a scheming old woman conspiring to cheat her daughter-in-law out of legitimate assets. The presentation lasted nearly an hour and felt devastatingly thorough to Daniel's untrained ears. Patricia Vance responded methodically, dismantling each argument with surgical precision. She demonstrated that the trust had been established 5 years before any divorce was contemplated, making fraud claims temporally impossible. She showed that the activation clause was a common estate planning tool designed to ensure assets reached intended beneficiaries without interference, citing numerous precedents where similar structures had been upheld. She argued that Margaret's exclusion of spouses was her absolute right as the owner of the assets, no different than any person choosing to leave their estate to charity rather than family. The trust was legal, properly executed, and beyond the reach of these proceedings. The judge listened to both sides with evident interest, asking pointed questions that revealed her own legal analysis taking shape. She pressed Rebecca's attorney on the fraud timeline, noting that 5 years seemed too long for a scheme designed around a specific divorce. She asked Patricia about cases where trusts had been pierced despite similar protections, and Patricia provided distinctions that satisfied the inquiry. By the time arguments concluded, Daniel sensed the momentum shifting in his favor, though he knew better than to assume anything about judicial decisions. Then Rebecca did something that changed everything. She requested permission to address the court directly over her attorney's visible objection. The judge allowed it, and Rebecca stood with the rigid posture of someone about to make a desperate gamble. She said that Daniel had always been a disappointing husband, someone who chose mediocrity over ambition, and seemed content to waste his potential changing light bulbs for strangers. She said that his mother had poisoned their marriage by constantly interfering, by treating Rebecca like a gold digger when all she wanted was a partner who matched her drive. She said that Daniel was not fit to raise their son alone, that Ethan deserved a parent who could provide opportunities rather than excuses, and that the court should consider carefully whether a man who had hidden millions from his own wife could be trusted with anything. The courtroom fell silent after Rebecca finished speaking. Daniel felt Patricia's hand on his arm, a warning not to respond. The judge's expression had hardened during Rebecca's monologue, and when she spoke again, her tone carried an edge that had not been there before. She reminded Rebecca that character attacks were not evidence, that parenting fitness would be determined through proper evaluation rather than courtroom speeches, and that accusations of hidden assets required proof rather than suspicion. She announced that she had heard enough to make preliminary rulings and would deliver her decisions after a brief recess. Daniel sat motionless as the court emptied for the recess, trying to process what had just happened. Rebecca had attacked him publicly, called him a failure and an unfit father in front of a judge who would decide his son's future. The cruelty of it stunned him even now, even after everything else she had done. He thought about Ethan waiting at home with the neighbor who watched him during court dates, blissfully unaware that his parents were fighting over him like property to be divided. Daniel had promised himself he would never let this divorce damage his son, but sitting here now, he wondered if that promise was already broken. The recess lasted 45 minutes, though it felt like hours to Daniel. He sat in the hallway on a wooden bench worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting, watching people pass without really seeing them. Patricia had stepped away to make phone calls, leaving him alone with thoughts that refused to settle into any coherent pattern. His mother had been rich. His wife thought he was a failure. A judge was somewhere behind closed doors, deciding whether he deserved to keep his son. The absurdity of it all pressed down on him until breathing felt like effort. Patricia returned with coffee and news. During the recess, Rebecca's attorneys had approached her about a settlement. They wanted to negotiate terms before the judge returned, hoping to salvage something from a case that had clearly turned against them. Patricia asked Daniel what he wanted, and he found that he did not have an answer. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to go home and hold his son and never think about courtrooms again. Beyond that, the specifics seemed to belong to someone else's life, a version of Daniel who understood what to do with millions of dollars and legal victories and the wreckage of a marriage he had genuinely believed would last forever. The judge returned before any settlement could be reached. She entered the courtroom with a folder of handwritten notes and an expression that suggested she had made her decisions and wasn't interested in further argument. Everyone took their seats in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Rebecca sat rigidly between her attorneys, no longer the confident woman who had smirked while signing divorce papers just hours ago. Her face had taken on a grayish pallor that makeup could not disguise, and her hands remained hidden beneath the table where no one could see them shake. The judge began by addressing the trust. She ruled that the Margaret Hartwell Family Trust was valid, properly executed, and beyond the reach of the divorce proceedings. She noted that the trust had been established 5 years prior to any marital dissolution, that its terms were consistent with legitimate estate planning, and that no evidence supported the claim that Daniel had known about or concealed its existence. The trust assets, including the Hartwell Holdings shares, investment accounts, and commercial property, belonged exclusively to Daniel and his son Ethan. Rebecca had no legal claim to any portion of them. Rebecca's lead attorney immediately requested a continuance to explore appellate options, but the judge denied the motion. She stated that the trust ruling was based on clear law and unambiguous facts, and that prolonging these proceedings would serve no purpose except to increase costs for both parties. She then turned to the question of the house, the original point of contention that had sparked this entire battle. Given the circumstances now revealed, she found that the house had been Margaret's separate property, transferred to Daniel as part of a larger estate plan designed to benefit him alone. Rebecca's claim to marital interest in the property was denied. The financial matters resolved, the judge moved to what she called the most important issue before the court: custody of the minor child, Ethan. She had reviewed the evaluator's report submitted prior to this hearing, which noted that Daniel served as the primary caregiver during the marriage and had continued in that role since the separation. The report recommended that Daniel retain primary physical custody with reasonable visitation rights for Rebecca. However, the judge added, today's proceedings had given her additional concerns about the parties' respective fitness. She addressed Rebecca directly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. The court had observed Rebecca's testimony with significant concern. Rather than focusing on her child's welfare, Rebecca had spent her time attacking Daniel's character, questioning his worth as a person, and attempting to undermine his relationship with their son. These were not the actions of a parent prioritizing their child's emotional health. The judge stated that she would be ordering a comprehensive custody evaluation, but based on today's evidence, she was inclined to grant Daniel sole legal and physical custody with supervised visitation for Rebecca until the evaluation was complete. Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. She began to speak, her voice cracking with emotion as she insisted this was unfair, that Daniel had manipulated everyone, that his mother had orchestrated everything from beyond the grave. The judge cut her off with a sharp command to sit down and address the court through her counsel. Rebecca's attorneys pulled her back into her seat, one of them whispering urgently, while the other gathered papers with hands that moved too quickly, betraying their own panic. The judge continued, as if the interruption had not occurred. She noted for the record that during discovery, Rebecca had failed to disclose several assets, including a brokerage account opened during the marriage and a valuable art collection purchased with marital funds. These omissions, discovered through the expanded financial review triggered by the trust revelation, constituted violations of disclosure requirements and would factor into the final division of acknowledged marital property. Rebecca would receive a reduced share of jointly held assets as a consequence of her failure to comply with discovery obligations. Daniel listened to these rulings with a strange sense of detachment. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to lose everything, prepared to surrender his childhood home just to escape a marriage that had been dying for years. Instead, he was being handed victories he had never sought, watching his ex-wife's carefully constructed case collapse under the weight of his mother's foresight. He should have felt triumphant, vindicated, something approaching satisfaction. Instead, he felt only tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Rebecca had been his wife. He had loved her once, or thought he did. Seeing her destroyed like this brought no joy, only the hollow ache of something that could never be repaired. The judge issued her final orders with business-like efficiency. The divorce was granted. Daniel retained full ownership of his mother's house and all trust assets. He was awarded primary custody of Ethan, pending the comprehensive evaluation. Rebecca received her personal belongings, her separate retirement account, and a reduced share of the joint savings that reflected her discovery violations. She was ordered to pay a portion of Daniel's legal fees as a sanction for bringing frivolous claims regarding the trust. Court was adjourned. Rebecca did not move when the gavel fell. She sat frozen in her chair while her attorneys packed their briefcases around her, their movements quick and mechanical, like people eager to distance themselves from a disaster. Daniel gathered his own papers slowly, giving her time and space he was not sure she deserved. Patricia touched his elbow and suggested they leave through the side entrance to avoid any confrontation. Daniel nodded, but found himself hesitating at the courtroom door, looking back at the woman he had married 7 years ago. She looked smaller now, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. The designer clothes and professional styling could not disguise the defeat written across her features. Her attorneys were speaking to her, probably explaining next steps or appellate options or other legal strategies. But she was not listening. Her eyes had found Daniel across the room, and in them he saw something he had never expected to see. Regret. Not remorse exactly, not an apology, but the bitter recognition of someone who had gambled everything on a calculated bet and lost completely. Daniel turned away and walked out of the courtroom without looking back again. Patricia led him through corridors he did not bother to memorize, past clerks and security guards, and other families caught in their own legal dramas. The autumn sun felt too bright when they finally emerged onto the courthouse steps. Daniel squinted against it, feeling like a man who had spent years in a dark room suddenly thrust into daylight. Everything looked different now, sharper and more vivid, as if the world had been waiting for him to finally see it clearly. He drove home in silence, the radio off and the windows cracked to let the cool October air wash over him. His mother's house appeared around the final corner, looking exactly as it always had. Modest, weathered, stubbornly standing despite decades of New England winters. Daniel parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the front porch where Margaret used to wait for him after school. She had known this day would come. She had prepared for it with the same quiet determination she had brought to everything else in her life. And she had done it all without ever telling him, trusting that he would understand when the time came. The front door opened, and Ethan came running out, his 5-year-old legs carrying him across the lawn at full speed. Daniel caught his son in a hug that lifted the boy off his feet, holding him close enough to feel his heartbeat and smell the familiar scent of playground dirt and apple juice. The neighbor waved from the doorway, and Daniel waved back, grateful for the kindness of people who helped without being asked. He carried Ethan inside and set him down in the kitchen, where Margaret's old table still held their breakfast dishes from that morning. Ethan asked if Daddy was okay, and Daniel said yes. Everything was going to be okay now. He did not explain what had happened in the courtroom or try to describe the strange journey from defeat to victory that had unfolded over the past hours. His son was too young for those stories and might never need to hear them anyway. What mattered was that they were home, that the house was theirs, that the future stretched ahead with possibilities Daniel had not allowed himself to imagine until today. That night, after Ethan fell asleep clutching his worn dinosaur, Daniel sat alone in his mother's chair by the living room window. The street outside was quiet, the neighbors' lights winking out one by one as the evening deepened into night. He thought about Rebecca leaving the courthouse, walking to her expensive car in her expensive clothes, returning to an apartment that no longer seemed like the stepping stone to something better. He did not wish her ill, not anymore. He simply did not think about her at all, if he could help it. His mother's photograph watched him from the mantel, her smile gentle and knowing, as always. Daniel raised an imaginary glass in her direction, a silent toast to the woman who had seen everything coming and had loved him enough to prepare for it. He did not know yet what he would do with the money or the shares or any of the other inheritances she had left behind. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the faith she had placed in him. And maybe, when Ethan was older, Daniel would tell him the story of a grandmother who had been quietly extraordinary, who had watched and waited and loved from the shadows until her moment came to save them both.